Each year, 24 of the top high school basketball prospects in the country are selected for the title of McDonald's All-American. This is a highly coveted title that many of the game's legends and current star players have on their resume. With this in mind, there has perhaps been no class more talented and hyped up than the McDonald's All-Americans from 2016, which included several of the most viral and iconic players that have ever come through high school basketball. However, the unfortunate reality when it comes to any All-American class from any year is that the odds of all 24 players going on to have successful NBA careers is simply not possible, and several players over the years have been unable to live up to the expectations that come with the accolade. And the 2016 McDonald's All-American class is no exception, featuring several players that fall all along the spectrum, with some going on to become NBA superstars and others not even being able to crack their team's rotation at the college level. With this in mind, I thought it'd be fun to look back at the 2016 All-American class and give my personal rankings based on their college and NBA success. If you like this type of content and want to see more, be sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more sports content. Now without further ado, let's get started. Coming in at the bottom spot of the list at number 24 is Sacha Kalea-Jones, who ranked as the number 6 power forward and 24th overall player in the 2016 class. For college, he'd go on to sign with the University of Kentucky, and despite going to Kentucky as a top 25 recruit in the country, the big man was never really able to make an impact for the Wildcats, averaging just 3 points per game in his 2 seasons with the program. And after an uneventful 2 years with Kentucky, he'd eventually make the decision to transfer to NC State, but would wind up having to sit out a year due to transfer rules at the time. However, during his year off, Jones would make the decision to back out of college and instead play professionally, where he's been playing ever since. Overall, despite all his talent, his lack of ability to even be a little productive at the college level lands him at the bottom of the list. At the 23 spot was the number 5 ranked small forward and 23rd overall player, VJ King, who'd go on to play his college ball at Louisville. After showing a lot of promise his freshman year, especially as a perimeter shooter, King was expected to really show out in his sophomore year and potentially get onto NBA radars. But unfortunately, his game never really quite developed as much as many expected. Despite starting all 36 games and receiving over 25 minutes per game his sophomore year, his stats only marginally improved, and his once promising shooting ability had fallen off a cliff. And things would only get worse his junior year as he'd lose his starting spot in the rotation and see his minutes cut in half. And to add insult to injury, his efficiency would get even worse, shooting 36% from the field and a mere 11% from 3. Surprisingly, King would still wind up declaring for the draft going undrafted, and is now playing overseas. Certainly a disappointing outcome for one of the top wings in the country coming out of high school. At the number 22 spot, I have the number 19 player in the class and number 3 shooting guard Josh Langford, who'd go on to play for the Spartans at Michigan State. After making steady improvements his first couple seasons, Langford would finally begin to break out in his junior year, starting off the season averaging 15 points and 3.5 rebounds, while shooting over 40% from 3. However, a foot injury would end up shutting him down for the rest of the season, and after undergoing surgery on his injured foot, he'd have to miss the entirety of the following season as well. And after finally returning to the court almost 2 seasons later, Langford unfortunately didn't look like the same player he was pre-injury, and any NBA momentum he had his junior year had fizzled out. At the conclusion of the season, he'd announced his retirement from basketball and now coaches at his alma mater, Madison Academy. This case serves as just another unfortunate example of injuries robbing a player of their potential and career. Moving on now to number 21 is point guard Altery Gilbert, who ranked 6th at his position and 31st in the country, going on to sign with the UConn Huskies. After seeing very limited action his first couple seasons, Gilbert finally got his opportunity to shine in his redshirt sophomore season, and managed to play pretty well, averaging over 12 points and 3 assists per game. The only issue, however, was his lackluster shooting percentages, which stood at 38% from the field and 33% from deep. And that trend would continue in his 4th year with the Huskies, once again struggling mightily with his efficiency. And after transferring to Wichita State for his final collegiate season, it would be much more of the same, and he'd finish his college career with shooting splits of 36% from the field and 30% from 3. Unfortunately, a combination of his poor shooting, small frame, and age really took him out of contention for the NBA, but all things considered, he still had a solid college career, averaging 10 points, almost 4 assists, and 1 all-conference team selection. In at number 20 is Andrew Jones, who ranked as the 30th overall player in the class and 7th overall at the shooting guard position. Following his time in high school, he'd signed with the University of Texas, and after a strong freshman season in which he averaged 11 points, 4 rebounds, and 3.5 assists, he certainly looked to be on a path to the NBA, but his momentum would unfortunately be halted by a leukemia diagnosis which would put him out of action for almost 2 full seasons. But when he did return to the court, he managed to largely pick up where he left off, going on to play 3 more seasons with the Longhorns. Overall, Overall, he had a very respectable college career, averaging 12 points, 3 rebounds, and was a one-time all-conference selection as well. But unfortunately, factors such as his inconsistent shooting and age coming out really held him back from being a true NBA prospect, and he'd wind up playing overseas. He certainly had all the talent in the world and the production to pair, but unfortunately, uncontrollable circumstances would prevent him from living up to his true potential. Up next is DeJuan Hewell, who was ranked as the number 7 power forward and 29th player overall, who'd go on to play his college hoops at the University of Miami. After his freshman season, the big man gave Canes fans a lot to be excited about, flashing his ability as a rebounder, rim protector, and skilled finisher at the rim. And he'd see strong improvements his sophomore year, averaging 11 points, over 6 rebounds, and shooting over 57% from the field. Going into his junior year, DeJuan was primed to be one of the best big men in the country, but unfortunately, his involvement in a corruption scandal revolving around Adidas would see him get his remaining college eligibility revoked, and after 2 unsuccessful attempts to get his eligibility back, he'd wind up declaring for the NBA draft, being selected with the 59th pick by the Toronto Raptors. In his 1 year in the NBA, he made 6 appearances, but he spent most of his time bouncing between G League rosters and overseas. If he was able to stay in college a bit longer and further develop, maybe things would have gone differently for him, but as things currently stand, he never quite reached the potential many thought he had coming out of high school. At number 18, I've got the number 16 overall player and number 2 center in the 2016 class, Marques Bolden, who joined an absolutely loaded recruiting class that year at Duke. After an uneventful freshman year in which he dealt with injuries, illness, and limited playing time, Bolden in his sophomore season would proceed to get buried in the rotation behind 2 talented freshmen in Marvin Bagley and Wendell Carter, who ate up most of the minutes at the big man spots. But luckily in his junior season, Bolden would finally get his opportunity to play a featured role for the Blue Devils. And while he did show some flashes, he really wasn't much of a contributor, and had a pretty disappointing season, averaging just 5 points and 3 rebounds. He would still end up declaring for the draft, going undrafted, but he has managed to stick around on G League rosters for the last few years, and even saw his first NBA action this most recent season. So while his time at Duke certainly didn't live up to the hype, it looks like he has the potential to maybe carve out a small role for himself in the NBA if he can keep playing well. Coming in at number 17 was 2016's number 5 point guard and 20th overall player, Kobe Simmons, a signee for the University of Arizona. Being highly touted as one of the best scorers in the class, Simmons was expected to make an immediate impact this freshman season. And while he didn't light up the stat sheet in any major way, he did have a solid first season, averaging almost 9 points and 3 assists. While he likely would have benefited from returning to college for another year of development, his physical frame and play style were thought to be translatable to the NBA, and as such, Simmons would test his luck in the draft. Unfortunately, his gamble would not pay off as he'd proceed to go undrafted, and has since become a fringe roster type of guy, killing it in the G League and getting the occasional call-up, yet never quite being able to get over the hump of making an NBA roster. But his ability to consistently stay right on the cusp of an NBA opportunity definitely gets him a slight edge in the rankings over everyone else mentioned so far. For the 16th spot on the list, I have shooting guard Kyle Guy, who ranked as the number 6 shooting guard and 28th overall player in the country. After signing with the University of Virginia, Kyle would go on to have probably the most successful college career of anyone else on this list, being selected first-team All-Conference and third-team All-American his sophomore and junior seasons, not to mention also being a national champion and tacking on a Most Outstanding Player award as well. But after being drafted with the 55th pick in 2019, his NBA career ended up being nowhere near as impressive, fizzling out after just 3 seasons of very limited playing time. Like I was alluding to earlier, however, although there's some previous guys on the list that have found a little more success in the NBA, in my eyes, his impressive college resume definitely holds quite a bit of weight, and I think gives him a bit of a bump in the rankings above the guys listed so far. Filling in the 15th spot is the big man TJ Leaf, ranked as the 3rd power forward in the class and 13th overall player. For college, he'd play for UCLA, where he'd go on to become one of the most impressive big men in the country, averaging 16 points and 8 rebounds on 61% shooting from the field. After his strong freshman season, Leaf would go on to declare for the NBA draft, being selected with the 18th pick by the Indiana Pacers. Over the course of his NBA career, he'd receive limited but very steady minutes, performing decently in his opportunities. Overall though, his production and skill set wasn't quite good enough for him to stick around in the NBA, but at the end of the day, he was able to stay around and be somewhat of a contributor in the NBA longer than anyone else so far. At 14, I've got probably the biggest guy on this list in Udoka Azubuike, who ranked as the 22nd player in the country and number 4 center in the class, going on to sign with the Kansas Jayhawks. Over the course of his collegiate career, he proved to be a steady and consistent player, putting up similar production in his sophomore and junior seasons, before finally taking a bit of a leap as a senior, averaging a double-double with 13 points and 10 rebounds, to go alongside over 2 blocks a game, being named Conference Player of the Year and a consensus All-American. His steady offensive game, combined with his defensive offensive upside would be enough to get him drafted with the 27th pick in the 2020 draft by the Utah Jazz. His NBA career so far has played out kinda similar to just discussed TJ Leaf, being a steady contributor on very limited minutes, but overall isn't much of a difference maker. I do give him the nod over TJ, however, due to having a slightly better college career and also the fact that he's currently still on an NBA roster. Coming in at the 13th spot, I have the freakishly athletic shooting guard Terrence Ferguson, who in the 2016 class ranked as the number 11 player and number 2 at his position. Following his high school career, instead of going the college route, he decided to immediately go professional and play overseas in Australia for a season. However, his time overseas would be extremely disappointing, averaging just over 4 points and 1 rebound a game. Nonetheless, he'd return to the US at the conclusion of the season and declare for the NBA draft, being selected 21st overall by the Oklahoma City Thunder. He never really amounted to much in the NBA, averaging just 4.5 points a game for his career, but he easily has the most NBA experience out of anyone on the list, having 124 career starts. Plus, with his insane athleticism, he also had some pretty crazy highlights during his short NBA stint, so he's a bit more memorable of a player in my eyes as well. Getting to the halfway point now, I've got the number 3 center and 17th overall player in the class, Tony Bradley, who'd plays college hoops at North Carolina. In his lone season with the Tar Heels, he mainly served as the team's backup center, and was pretty productive in that role, averaging 7 points and 5 rebounds. Not only that, but his squad would eventually go on to win the national championship that year, and shortly after, Bradley would declare for the NBA draft. And after being selected with the 28th pick by the Lakers, he'd immediately be traded to the Jazz, with the hope of eventually developing into a quality backup for Rudy Gobert. But unfortunately, this would never come into fruition, and following his time with the Jazz, he'd find himself being passed around to several different franchises, being a steady contributor for some and pure benchwarmer for others. But given the fact that he has shown to be decently productive when given minutes, more so than Terrence Ferguson and anyone else so far, I do give him the slight edge here in the rankings. Ranking just outside the top 10 is point guard Frank Jackson, who ranked as the number 10 player in the class and number 4 point guard. Yet another player a part of Duke's loaded 2016 recruiting class, Jackson would make an immediate impact as a freshman for the Blue Devils, averaging almost 11 points per game on solid shooting numbers. And after his lone season at Duke, he declared for the draft, being selected just outside the first round with the 31st pick by the New Orleans Pelicans. In his time there, he proved to be a steady piece in the rotation, and was even capable of starting in a pinch. And after eventually making his way to the Detroit Pistons, he'd serve a very similar role, and would even have his best career season with the Pistons in 2021, averaging over 10 points per game. But things would only go downhill for him after that, playing in just one game the following season before eventually having to sign overseas. Despite a very quick drop-off, he did play a lot of quality NBA minutes and showed he was capable of being decently productive in those minutes as well. Moving into the top 10 now, I've got the number 1 small forward and number 2 overall player in the class, Josh Jackson, another signee of the Kansas Jayhawks. And in his time at Kansas, he certainly lived up to the hype, averaging 16 points, 7 rebounds, to go alongside 1 block and 1 steal per game his freshman season. And soon after the season, he'd go on to declare for the NBA draft, where he was widely considered one of the top prospects in the class. As an uber athletic wing with high two-way upside, NBA front offices and scouts saw a guy that could potentially be the next Kawhi Leonard or Paul George. And with the hype surrounding his potential, he'd go on to be selected with the 4th overall pick by the Phoenix Suns. Despite showing some promise his rookie season, averaging 13 points and 4 rebounds, in the end, he never quite developed as well as the Suns hoped, with the biggest weakness in his game being his terribly inconsistent shooting. And after just 2 seasons in Phoenix, Jackson would be traded away. Since then, he's had several opportunities over the years for several teams, but his inefficiency concerns just made it too hard to keep him on the floor, eventually getting to the point where no teams were willing to sign him to their active roster. And as of now, his last NBA appearance was in 2022. In at the 9th spot is one of the lower ranked guys on the list, center Zach Collins, who ranked as the 38th player in the class and number 6 for his position. After signing with Gonzaga, he'd served most of his freshman season as a steady contributor off the bench, averaging 10 points, 5 rebounds, and almost 2 blocks a game. However, after some strong performances in the NCAA tournament, he'd quickly start shooting up draft boards, eventually finding himself projected as a lottery pick. And after declaring for the draft, he went on to be selected with the 10th pick by the Sacramento Kings, and then traded to the Portland Trail Blazers. During his time in Portland, he primarily served as the team's backup center, and was decently productive in that role, but after signing with the San Antonio Spurs in 2021, he's really managed to step up his game, putting up career numbers the last 2 seasons. Although it's unlikely he ever develops into an all-star caliber player, as of now, he's the first one on the list so far that's been able to carve out a consistently productive role in the NBA. Filling in the 8th spot is a player that's had a pretty interesting career to say the least, and that's Markelle Fultz, who ranked as the number 2 point guard and number 7 player in the 2016 class, signing to play collegiately at the University of Washington. In his freshman year at Washington, although the team as a whole was very mediocre, Markelle individually blossomed into one of the best and most entertaining players in all of college basketball, putting up a highly productive 23 points, 5 assists, and 5 rebounds on elite shooting numbers. The combination of his production, athleticism, and polished offensive game would make him a highly touted prospect, with many experts pinning him as a potential superstar and franchise cornerstone. But after being selected first overall by the Philadelphia 76ers, his NBA career would immediately hit a roadblock, as medical complications with his shoulders forced him to completely rework his jump shot, which was a huge blow considering his jump shot was his biggest strength. And unfortunately, he was never able to regain the shooting ability he once had, and after a string of disappointing seasons in Philly, they'd eventually ship him out to the Orlando Magic. Although to this day he still has an ineffective jump shot, he's managed to use his strengths in other areas to become a pretty productive player for the Magic. In fact, in 2022, he had his best career season to date, averaging 14 points and 5 rebounds. So although he's likely never to become the star player many thought he would be, he still managed to carve out a pretty solid NBA career for himself. Up next is one of the biggest names, not just in the 2016 class, but all of high school basketball history, Lonzo Ball, who ranked as the number 1 point guard and number 4 overall player in the class, going on to play for UCLA. After his historic high school career, Lonzo would go on to also find success at the collegiate level, putting up an impressive freshman season, averaging 14 points, 7 assists, 6 rebounds, and almost 2 steals a game for the Bruins. And after declaring for the draft, the Los Angeles Lakers would go on to select him with the 2nd overall pick, with expectations of being the team's point guard of the future. Although he never quite found success in LA, he's managed to really grow and develop into a solid player over the years. With the Pelicans, his jump shot drastically improved, and he'd also make great strides defensively, getting a reputation as one of the best on-ball defenders in the NBA. And after his trade to Chicago, he really started to come into his own, and for a time looked like he could be one of the best all-around players in the NBA. But unfortunately, right as he was seemingly reaching his peak, he'd begin having serious issues with his knee, which has caused him to miss the last 2 seasons and put his career in serious doubt. It's honestly kind of hard to rank him on the list as it's been so long since he's last played, and with all the skepticism of if he'll be the same player when he does eventually return. But based on his body of work so far, I think he's certainly earned a spot over all the players mentioned so far. Moving on now to number 6, I've got the electrifying Malik Monk, who ranked as the number 1 shooting guard in the class, number 9 overall player, and was one of the 3 top 10 players in Kentucky's 2016 recruiting class. In his freshman season, he'd immediately established himself as one of the most dynamic scorers in all of college basketball, averaging just under 20 points per game on solid shooting splits. And after declaring for the draft and being selected with the 13th pick by the Charlotte Hornets, he was expected to take on a similar type of scoring role in the NBA. And after a rather slow start to his career, he slowly started to find his scoring groove in recent years, and recently had his best season of his career, averaging over 15 points, 5 assists, and being the runner-up for the 6th Man of the Year award. Although it took some time, Monk has certainly developed into the talented dynamic scorer he was projected to be coming out of high school. The only question is just how much more room he has to grow. Getting into the top 5 now, I've got the explosive small forward, Miles Bridges, ranking as the number 8 player in the class and number 3 at his position. After signing with Michigan State, he put up a strong freshman season, averaging 16 points and 8 rebounds, and followed it up with a similarly productive sophomore season, averaging 17 points and 7 rebounds a game. Declaring for the draft shortly after, he'd go on to be selected with the 12th pick by the Charlotte Hornets and would proceed to improve season by season before breaking out in year 4, averaging 20 points and 7 rebounds a game. And he's shown that season wasn't a fluke either, with him putting up very similar numbers this most recent season. Overall, although I think he's very close to his peak in terms of how good of a player he can be, he's certainly been more productive and has more upside than anyone on the list so far. In at the number 4 spot is the top-ranked center in the class and number 15 overall player, Jarrett Allen, who would take his talents to the University of Texas. And he'd have a very solid freshman year for the Longhorns, averaging 13 points, 8 rebounds, and a block and a half per game. His production and physical tools were enough to get him on NBA radars. And after his lone season in college, he declared for the draft, being selected with the 22nd pick by the Brooklyn Nets. In the NBA, he'd make an immediate impact as a rebounder and rim protector, and has continually improved each year, accumulating 4 seasons averaging a double-double, as well as an all-star selection in 2021. He's certainly not one of the elite centers in the NBA, but he has shown to be one of the most steady and well-rounded, and alongside Evan Mobley, the two make up one of the better front courts in the NBA. Getting into the top 3 now, we're starting to see guys that are some of the better players at their positions in the NBA, and that starts with power forward Bam Adebayo, ranking as the number 5 overall player and number 2 power forward in the class. Serving as the big man in Kentucky's stacked 2016 recruiting class, he'd go on to be the main enforcer for that Wildcats team, averaging 13 points, 8 rebounds, and a block and a half per game. After declaring for the NBA draft following his freshman season, he'd be selected with the 14th pick by the Miami Heat, and after a slow start to his career, he's now developed into one of the top big men in the league. He's proven to be an elite defender, being an all-defensive team selection each of the last 5 seasons, but his offense has come a long way as well, averaging around 20 points per game his last 3 seasons. Overall, he's one of the most versatile and talented big men in the NBA, and if he keeps playing at his current level, he'll continue to rack up even more awards and accolades. At the runner-up spot is the speed demon De'Aaron Fox, who ranked as the number 2 point guard and number 6 player in the class of 2016. Upon entering college at Kentucky, Fox immediately became one of the most athletic and electrifying guards in all of college basketball, and was arguably the fastest player in the entire country. And he'd put those physical traits to good use, averaging 16 points, 4 assists, and 4 rebounds a game his freshman year for the Wildcats. After a strong collegiate season, Fox would declare for the draft and wind up being selected with the 5th overall pick by the Sacramento Kings to be their point guard of the future. And after consistent improvement each season, he's now developed into one of the best point guards in the NBA, racking up 1 All-Star selection and 1 All-NBA team selection. He's definitely deserving of more All-Star selections, but the NBA is just filled with so much talent at the guard position that unfortunately Fox is one of those guys that barely misses the cut. The fact that a player can average over 26 points, 5 assists, and 2 steals a game on a playoff team and not be an All-Star is honestly tragic. But it just goes to show how spoiled we are with elite guard play in the NBA. Either way though, Fox is an exciting young talent in the NBA, and he still has room to grow. All I'm going to say is that if he develops a reliable jumper from 3, the league is going to be in serious trouble. And lastly, coming in as the clear best player from this 2016 McDonald's All-American class is Jason Tatum, ranking as the number 2 small forward and number 3 overall player in the class. Headlining Duke's tremendously talented 2016 recruiting class, he'd go on to make an immediate impact for the Blue Devils, averaging 16 points, 7 rebounds, as well as a steal and a block per game his freshman season. And after declaring for the draft, he was viewed as one of the most offensively polished players in the class, with an incredibly high upside. Thus, he would go on to be selected with the 3rd pick in the draft by the Boston Celtics, and during his time in Boston, he's developed into one of the best scorers and overall players in the entire NBA, racking up 5 All-Star selections and making 4 All-NBA teams. And after winning his first NBA championship this most recent season, he's already established himself as a Boston legend, and is now slowly building his resume for being an all-time great player in NBA history. And with him likely entering his prime over the next couple seasons, I'm very excited to see what Tatum has in store as the Celtics continue to compete for NBA championships. So that was every McDonald's All-American from the 2016 class, ranked based on their collegiate and NBA success. Overall, we can see a diverse range of success for all the various players, with some easily living up to the hype they had coming out of high school, and others unfortunately failing to live up to the expectations of the coveted title. Be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe to the channel for more sports content. Feel free to leave your opinions in the comments whether you agree with my rankings or not, and players you'd put higher or lower. I'm always down for some friendly discussion. This is HTP signing off. As always, I hope you have a great rest of your day. I'm out.